Okay, welcome everybody to Intro to React. Thank you for coming. As advertised, this session is for people who have heard of the buzz about React, but are kind of clueless about it and would like to learn a little bit about what it is. So hopefully you fall into that category and you're in the right session. All the slides are at bit.ly/nerds19react, so you don't have to worry about writing down any links you see in here or anything like that. My name is Rick Hood. In a previous life, I was in the boat building business down in Rhode Island. I took a left turn in 2000 and went into graphic design and website development. I still have a foot in the marine industry as I publish a Yacht Insider's Guide every year. And then finally, in 2011, I joined Common Media, where I'm the lead Drupal developer. And I'm also an organizer of Nerd Summit, and I help out at New England Drupal Camp. So about this session. I want to try to give you a basic knowledge of what React is, and then I want to try to give you direction on how to learn more about it, those two things. I'm an experienced Drupal developer, but I'm new to React, so 6 months ago I knew nothing about React, and hopefully I know enough to give this session out. But also I'm hoping that that gives the session a beginner perspective that maybe a more advanced person wouldn't do. I'm jumping a little bit here to how to learn React because this is how I learned it. I took these two courses, one by Wes Boss and one by Scott Talinsky, and I highly recommend their podcast called Syntax. It's really, really good. It's a front-end podcast basically, but they cover a lot of JavaScript. And then the docs at the React website are very good, so you can just start there too if you like. There's some more information in the last slide about how to learn, but I really wanted to show this slide to show everything I'm showing you I learned with these courses. So more about this session. There's going to be like two sections to it. One is some background about what and why React, just explaining where it came from and why people use it. And then the second is dive deeper into what React really is. In other words, look at the code. So what is React? This is the homepage of the React website. The description is pretty good. It's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Anybody here use jQuery? So you can think of it just like jQuery, except it's got more stuff in it. So like when you load in jQuery, you can use jQuery functions. If you load in React, you can use React-style functions and code. So that's basically what it is. Some people call it a framework, maybe because you can build whole sites with it, but it's still just a library. So why use React? In the old days, websites used to be static. They didn't do much. They weren't interactive. Then along came JavaScript and jQuery, and you would click something and something cool would happen, or something would change, or you'd hover over something and something would change. So websites became interactive. But JavaScript or jQuery became unmanageable for complex interactions where when you click something on a page, like 10 different things happen at once or whatever. And although you can do it, it becomes unwieldy to do such things. So along came frameworks or libraries or whatever you want to call them. Angular, Ember, other ones came along to try to solve this problem. React came along in around 2013. I think that's when it was open sourced. React was created by Facebook or somebody at Facebook, and it's still maintained by Facebook. I think the reason why React took off is that it was the first one to do something called a virtual DOM, which means that React has its own DOM. Everybody know what DOM is? It's document object model, I think. It basically means the HTML on your page, the stuff on your page. So React has its own virtual DOM where it keeps track of changes, and then it kind of merges those into the real DOM. So it makes things much faster. What happens is that React only changes pieces of the DOM that need to change based on what you did. It doesn't like reload the whole DOM of the whole page. So it was very zippy, very fast, and I think that's one of the reasons why it took off. So this is an example. This is the course. This is the site that you build when you take this React for Beginners course by Wes Boss. And this is a pretty good example of where React is really useful. So here I'm adding a fish to the order, and you could do that with JavaScript, jQuery, whatever. That's no big deal. But now if I go over here and change the price, See how it's updating in two other places? So that's the advantage of React. You update things in one place, and it updates all kinds of other places at the same time. Here I'm changing the name of the fish. So that's a good example of where React becomes useful. So how would I do this catch of the day app with jQuery? It would be kind of a nightmare. So what React does is it constantly looks for changes to the app's state, like what state is the app in, like what price is the fish, etc. And then when something changes, it passes the information from state to all the components that are in the React app. And we'll talk about what state and components are in a minute. This is a really great article about why React took off, so I highly recommend reading that. That's at Nerds 19, Why React. But again, these are all in the slides. So if we look at this again, what's going on here is when I add it to the order, that's putting it into the state of the app. I kind of think of the state as being at the top. And then all the other components are listening and pulling down that changed information in state. So when I change the price, I'm pushing it up into the state, and the other things are bringing it back down because it sees a change of state. This is what you build if you take Scott Tolinsky's course, React 16 for Everyone. This, I'm really just showing this because it shows kind of how fast things can load. This is pulling a movies database in as JSON, and then it's built with React. So it's very zippy because it changes only what it needs to change. So that's an example, another example of a React app. I want to just mention quickly another reason to use React, or really to use a JavaScript front end, is because it's kind of a thing these days to talk about separating the front end from the back end. So you might use Drupal, WordPress, Contentful, whatever on your back end, and all the back end does is serve JSON usually as the API, and then you can do your front end in whatever you want to do it in. So one advantage of that is you can have front end people working on your site that know nothing about what the back end does. All they have to know about is how to take JSON and use Angular, React, whatever with it. And then the other advantage is since you've got that JSON already, you can use it in a mobile phone app or whatever you want to use it in. So the separation of front end and back end has become quite a big thing these days. But that's nothing to do with React per se. It's just to do with JavaScript front end versus regular old HTML front end. There's a session, I think it's going on right now, but you can watch the video of it, where Jeff St. Pierre is taking the Contenta CMS and using something called Nuxt, which I think is a way to use Vue.js. Vue is another library that's like React that a lot of people love, so Vue might be another thing to look into for you. One of the things I wondered when I first heard about React is, does this mean nothing works if JavaScript isn't enabled? Yeah, that's correct. This is what Facebook looks like if you disable JavaScript. So that's the way these things work. They need JavaScript. But a lot of big sites are using React. Facebook, Airbnb, Dropbox, BBC. Many big sites are using it. But React does not have to be your whole site. It doesn't have to take over the whole page. You can imagine like a block in a page of your site that you want to be very app-like, and you could build that part in React, but everything else is still regular, whatever you build in. So now let's take a deeper dive into what React really is code-wise. So while React can get really complicated, in my opinion, there's three key things that if you understand these things, you understand the basics of React. One is components, one is props, and one is state. So components, props, and state. Components are pretty much what they sound like. They're kind of like Lego building blocks. The example in that last app that you looked at is a fish is a component, so that's a component in React. The order is a component as well. So you've probably you probably understand the idea of building websites with components. React does that very well. Props is short for properties. An example of that would be the price is a property of the fish component, and props are a way that you get stuff into, well, data into components. We'll talk about that more in a minute. In state, I think of as kind of a mini local database that stores what's going on in the app. So an example, again, is the price of the fish, the current price of the fish is stored in state. And so when the fish component needs that price, it grabs it from state and sticks it in there. And the way it gets there, and again, we'll go over this, but it grabs the state, it gets into the component via the props. So this is a little stupid demo that is a very simple one, where all it does is there's a little nerdy spinning, and when you click the button, it stops spinning. You could do this without React, of course, but I just wanted to do a super simple demo to show how this works. So we're going to look into the code of this demo app. Maybe I'll back up for a minute. This was made with Create React App. If you go there, it'll give you instructions on how to start up a React app like that. And you basically get something that looks a lot like this, a very simple React app, and then you can go in and play around with it. So if I look inside the folder of this app, this is what I see. Node modules, that contains all the JavaScript libraries that you need. It includes React, but it includes a whole bunch of other stuff. If you look inside that folder, it'll be scary because there's a gazillion libraries in there, but you kind of don't have to worry about it, because package.json is the file that tells you what it needs in that folder. And when you, this will be in the instructions if you go to create React app, if you do npm install or npx install, it will look in package.json and install everything in node modules that you need, so you really don't need to worry about it. There's a public folder, and the only thing I'll talk about there is the Index.html file. There is an HTML file, and we'll get into that in the next slide. And then the src folder is where everything happens. This is where your components are and other stuff is. And in this particular app, there are two components, app.js and nerdy.js. And we'll look at both of those in detail. Index.js is important because it's what attaches the app.js to the index.html. Nothing too much else to talk about here. You can install this with Yarn, I think, so you can do Yarn install instead of npm install, I think. But it'll give you those instructions on Create React App. That's what that's for. So that's it for this slide. So the other thing I wondered about is this all JavaScript? Is there no HTML at all? And there is one HTML file, the Index.html file, which you saw in the previous slide. All that has to have in it is a div with an ID that could be root or could be anything else, but it's got to have a div and an ID. And then that line at the bottom of the code here, React DOM render, what that's saying is take my app component and attach it to the div named root. So that's how you get your React app into the page to begin with. But this is really the only HTML involved here. Everything else is JavaScript. And that index.js file, which you saw in the src folder here, contains this code that attaches your React app to that HTML, to that div with the ID of root. So let's look at what a component looks like. So pretty much all React apps have a parent component, and it's called app.js. I don't think you have to call it app.js, but I think everybody does, and I would just leave that alone. So the main parent component is app.js. If I look inside that, it looks like this. So at the top of every component, you have to import React. You'll see a lot of this importing stuff going on at the top of any component. So it's importing React, and it's importing the component part of React that it needs to be a component. And then the other import there is just a simple thing where, the other import there is importing another component that I'm using. So I have two components, the parent one called app and a child one called nerdy. So to create the app component, you do class app extends component. You have to always have this render, so you have to render something. The render has to return something, so those things are always there. And then between the two blue divs where it says class name app and it ends the div, that's your stuff, that's your content. And it looks like HTML, but actually isn't. I'll explain that in the next slide. But you can see my other component is in there, nerdy. And those orange things, spin state, nerdy class, and nerdy text, those are props, which I'll go into more detail. But that's how we're passing data into that nerdy component. But the important thing here for now is that I'm creating a component called app, and it happens to contain another component called nerdy. And if you look at complex React apps, they'll contain a lot more child components than nerdy. And child components can have other child components. So if I were to go into nerdy, I could have other components that loads, etc. And then at the bottom of every component, you have to export the components. So export default app, or if I was in the nerdy one, it would be export default nerdy. So that's what a typical component looks like. So I said that it looks like HTML, but it isn't. It isn't HTML. It's called JSX, which I think it's an ECMAScript thing. It's not a React thing, but React uses it. You don't have to use JSX with React, but everybody does, and it's easy to use, so I would just recommend using it. So the only really things to remember here are two. One is that when you're using JSX, you have to have a containing div. So the blue is a containing div. If I were to have two divs at the same level, it would error. Although I think maybe the most recent version of React has ways of getting around that. But for now, just assume that you have to contain everything in a containing div like that. And the only other thing to know is you can't use class. You have to use class name, because class is a reserved name in JavaScript, so we can't just say class equals app for CSS. We have to say class name equals app. And those are kind of the only two things that are tricky about JSX. But so let's look at the nerdy component. So this also at the top has import React component and import logo. This is just an example of how you can, by doing this, I can then use logo down in here instead of having to write the path to the image all the time. So this is another example of how you can import stuff. And here again, I'm saying class nerdy extends component, so I'm creating the class there. I've got the render, I've got the return, and then I've got the containing div with a class name of nerdy. Then you can see I've got an image that the SRC is loading the logo object. And then here, here's where I'm using those props. So see where it says this.props.nerdy class? It can do that because it got those props over here. So it got passed in the nerdy class prop there. So when I come back here, I can use it by referencing props. So it's this.props.nerdy class is a way I can reference that stuff. The only other thing going on here is just saying if the spin state is true, then print little nerdy is spinning. If it's false, print little nerdy is no spin. So that's my child component. I forgot to mention this, but it's kind of common convention to have your components be in a file of the same name. So this is nerdy component is a file in a file called nerdy.js. You don't have to do that. You can actually have all your components in one file, but everybody does it this way to separate out components into files. Props. I'm probably going to repeat myself here, but this is part of that app component. And again, I'm showing how I'm passing in these props. Spin state, nerdy class, nerdy text. That's getting passed into the nerdy component so that I can then use it down here. So I can say this.props.nerdy class, go grab nerdy class from props. And over there, I'm grabbing my text from props. Everybody get that?
So that is where the properties are defined. Is within.
They're defined here. So here I'm saying I want nerdy to have a property called spin state, and this is what it's going to be. We'll talk about what this means because we haven't talked about state yet. But this one's an easier example where I simply say nerdy text is simply text. So I'm defining them there, but then I'm using them here. When I say this.props, I'm grabbing them out of the props.
This nerdy tag, is that how I bring in the component?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So I could bring it in like 3 times too if I want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So what is state? So up at the top of the app component, I've just declared state like this. And state is like a key value pair. So I've got 2 parts of the state, spin and nerdy. And I've set spin to true, and I've set nerdy to spin. And so state can then be accessed in other components by doing this. So here I'm passing against spin state into the nerdy component, and I'm saying make spin state equal to the state of spin. Everybody see that? And then in a function, I can change what the state of spin is. So I can change it to false when I click the button. So when you saw the app, when I'm clicking the button, what it's doing is it's changing the state to false and it stops spinning. And I do that with CSS or whatever. So that's how that works. We're going to actually look at that in action in a minute. So I really want you to focus on components, props, and state, but I'm just showing you a couple of little other things quickly to show you there is more to React than just that. Routes, this is how routes work with React, where here you see it's saying that if the path is the root of the site, load the store picker component. If the path is store with store ID, load the actual app component. And if the route is nothing, not found. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I just wanted to show you that there's other stuff in React besides components, props, and state. And then also with links, you can use an actual A tag in React, but if you do, it will just load the whole page and kind of defeat the purpose. What this link stuff does is do that thing I talked about where it's only going to load the part that changed. So that's another thing to know about. Here you can see different paths down here where this is on a different app where it's loading the movies list component, and this is loading the movie detail with the ID of the movie. You're going to want to get React Developer Tools extension for Chrome. It's probably with Firefox too. I'm not sure. I just use Chrome, so because you can really see cool stuff with that. You can, if you've got it installed, you can click the React tab, and then you can actually look at the components inside of your app, and you can actually see the props and state over here. So I'm going to get out of my presentation a little bit, and we'll look at that. So here's my little nerdy thing. And if I go over to the React tab, and you can see my app is my main component. If I pop that, oh, you can't see that, can you? So, and then you can see the nerdy component in there. And if I click this, see the way that the props changed? Oops. And if I go to the app, you can see the state changing. Cool, huh? So that right there kind of shows you this is what React does.
What does the actual markup look like? I'm just curious if you go back over elements. It doesn't look like much of anything.
There's my root. So see, there's the root that the app is getting attached to. It should just be regular HTML. So when you're looking at this, it's just regular HTML. So it's taken that JSX and turned it into HTML.
That's the generated HTML. And can you actually, like, with the React plugin, can you go to other React sites and see, like, what they're doing?
Yeah,
or,
sure. Go to Facebook and look at that with us. It's wild. Yeah. It's also a way to tell if a site is using React, because it won't work if it isn't.
looks a lot neater than Angular does when it's written out.
Yeah. So again, super simple app. Let me look at the catch of the day app. Okay, so I'm in the app there, and here it's more complicated, but you can see that it's got a bunch of fishes. Those are these fishes on the left, and it's got order information. So if I pop open this order, let me go up a little bit more, and see I've got one of fish 1, 2 of fish 2, and 1 of fish 4. If I add king crab, you'll see that I just added fish 5. If I add it again, it's now got 2 of those, so it's changing the state of that. And then the order component looked at that and said, okay, update my order component to, now I have 2 king crabs. Yeah, this is just that. This one. Oops, not sure why that's not working. The React website is super good, has super good documentation on it, so I think if you click Get Started, it has all the info here about how to get started with Create React App. And then this was that article I talked about that's really good to read, that explains what's good about React, why React is taken off. Let me go back to my presentation. Any questions so far? Because that's most of the talk right there. Yeah.
What are the implications on SEO if you're building?
It's basically fine. Like there's no reason why it should be any different. You can still what matters is how the HTML spits out, and that's controlled by what JSX you write. So that's basically what I've heard.
I imagine you could also have the meta tags as part of the HTML page and not touch that with the
True.
With the
Yeah. I'm personally much more interested in making pieces of the page React, not the whole site React, because that's kind of that's pretty serious change to how you do things. Also, you need a separate server to host the React stuff from your Drupal site or something like that, I think. So it's more involved, and I think not many sites maybe need that. But I can see having a widget on a site that's some functionality that's needed for some company, and it might work great in React.
One thing I always wonder about, and maybe this is more advanced, is sort of if you have a pretty traditional development stack where you have a relational database behind it, is that how do you connect to something like that with something like React?
So in the catch of the day tutorial, he connects it to Google Firebase, which is a database thing. So he shows you how that you can take that state. I've only showed you the local state, and if you reload the page, it goes away. So I've showed you the local state. You can actually push that up to a database and store it in Firebase. It's kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but you can do that. And you could do that with a Drupal site as well, or anything where you're storing the database. There's ways of taking that state that's changed and pushing it up to a database.
Is JSX part of React, or is it part of JavaScript itself? Not that I know how I would use it without React.
It's essentially part of JavaScript, but I think it's really part of ECMAScript, which is above JavaScript. So I think it's part of that, but React picked it up and used it. I don't know if other frameworks use it or not. Yeah.
What are the concerns with screen readers and accessibility? Anything?
Well, they're seeing HTML in the end, so it's as long as your HTML is good, there's no real difference,
I'm sure there's things you have to be worried about if the page is suddenly changing dramatically and the screen reader gets lost or things like that.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
Just a comment about that. If you're having interactions on the page, you can use ARIA tags for accessibility, but you should make sure you know how they work before you use them.
There's a presentation on that this afternoon.
Oh, cool.
Thank you.
So
I just had a question. What made it spin? Was that in the React or was that CSS?
I think that was JavaScript and CSS that made it spin, so that's nothing special. What's key there is that when I clicked the button, it was changing the state, which then changed the class on the on the little nerdy thing which made it spin. So what made it spin is something else, which
Wasn't
I actually
React.
don't remember. It wasn't React. But the key thing there is the way that I changed the class on the component was with React, which is a ridiculous example because it's way overkill to do it on that, but it's just a simple example. So, yeah.
Is there like any like performance concerns for things like slow internet connections or mobile devices? Because my understanding is like things like filling out a form, it's listening on each keystroke and it's like doing some thought every time versus like a static page. You could like fill out like an input field and nothing's happening until you start submitting stuff. And React's kind of like looking at each thing all the time if you're setting up to be like a state, right?
I don't know about that. I don't know, I wish I knew, but I don't know what React does if you're just filling out a form, like whether it's really looking at that or not, or whether you have to submit the button for it to even care. I'm not sure. But I've heard that React can be a problem on, slow mobile devices maybe. I'm not sure why, but also it's got a render on the page, so it takes more rendering stuff than just a regular HTML page. You can, though, compile, and I don't know enough about this stuff, you can compile your React on the server so that it serves HTML. And I think, I want to say that, what's that thing that's got the buzz? Gatsby. I think Gatsby may do that because it uses React. So to deploy, I won't go into this too much, but the way that you do it, you have to create a build version of your app. So, and this is all described on the React pages, and then you just deploy it wherever you want to deploy it. I'd recommend, if you want to play with that, to just try deploying to GitHub pages, and there's information at these links about how to do that. So it's super easy to get started. Just go to React, do create React app, try deploying it, just play around with it. It's really pretty easy to get started. This is pretty important. So the biggest thing you're going to run into with React is not React, it's ES6. So you'll see strange looking JavaScript that you may not have seen before. So one of them is at the top here, this is kind of the normal way to do a function, but in React they use a lot of ES6 arrow functions. These are called arrow functions, and they're kind of like shorthand ways of writing things. You're going to see a lot of shorthand ways of doing things that you're going to wonder, what is that doing? Fortunately, these two courses, if you were to take them, they're really good at like building it the not shorthand way and then say, we can do it shorthand, so here's how you do it shorthand, so it shows you both ways. And when I was doing those courses, I put tons of comments in the code to just say, it used to be this, and now it's this, to try to remember that stuff. But I don't know whether I'd say go learn ES6 first before learning React, or just dive into React and pick up the ES6 as you need it. I think I'd favor the latter, but it's up to you. But you're definitely going to have to learn about ES6 stuff. And if you don't know, ES6 isn't read by browsers. There's something called Babel, which compiles the ES6 into JavaScript that browsers can read. It's a lot like compiling Sass into CSS, because browsers can't read Sass, but they can read CSS. I'm told that Babel's pretty hard to figure out the configuration of, but you kind of don't need to because React does that for you, so you just really never have to look into the Babel stuff. Unless you're doing something advanced, but you certainly don't for this.
So if you just put the second code into like vanilla JavaScript wouldn't know what to do with it then?
If you don't compile that with Babel or something, the browser won't know what to do. And then this is just some other resources. Some of them I already mentioned. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, I would just dive into one of these courses, or just go to the React page and just start doing create React app. And I found it a lot of fun because this is the only time I've really done any non-Drupal website work, and it's like, oh yeah, you can build websites without Drupal, and it was really kind of fun to like do that as a fun thing to do. So that's my talk. It's probably early, so we probably got plenty of time. Yeah, it's only 11:34. Any other questions?
Are there any existing libraries or components for turning Drupal forms into React
Good question.
forms.
Yeah. I don't know enough about that. Yeah, how would you take a form and yeah.
I'll disclose, I'm the maintainer of one form library, so there's no perfect answer, but there's some people writing, it's more on GitHub happening, where if you do like, if you go to web forms and look at it, you'll get some links to some GitHub libraries where they're taking form API and serializing it to React components. I think it's very limited functionality, like you can build a contact link. At the same time, of course, Drupal's trying to redo the admin UI using React in the UI initiative, admin UI initiative. They are trying to wrap their head around the problem. It's a big one. It's a doozy because there's a lot of functionality in Drupal, like back-end functionality that needs to be ported to the front end. But if you do searches for like Drupal form or web form React, you'll find these libraries on, and they're mostly on GitHub and not Drupal, which actually makes more sense. So that's the answer I got there.
Thank you.
Does everybody feel like they got the idea behind components, props, and state? Okay, cool. So if you get that idea and you sort of understood the code of how it does stuff, then that's what React is. All right, thank you.